Hi, welcome to Unit 4. So this is our second unit that focuses solely on HTML. We're going to have a few more units that cover more HTML, and we're going to be using HTML in every lesson. But really, this is the last unit that's pure HTML, and then starting in Unit 5, we introduce CSS plus HTML. So in this unit, there are two big topics that we're going to talk about. The first one are HTML tables, and then the second part of this unit is all about forms in HTML. So our first objective is just to understand the different elements involved in making an HTML table, and then be able to actually replicate a table on your own. And then we'll have an exercise, and this exercise is going to test your ability to make a table using the 5 or 6 elements that I'm going to show you that you need to use to make a table. And then once we do that, we're going to transition into HTML forms, and our main objective there is for you to be able to write valid forms using the HTML form tag, HTML input tag, the select tag, and then also incorporate labels and validations. And then we'll have another exercise at the end of the unit where I give you a more complicated form. It's pretty complex, won't lie, lots of different pieces, and I'll ask you to recreate it with HTML on your own, and then of course there'll be a solution video as well. So tables and forms, and then coming up in the next unit, we finally get to CSS. All right, let's get started. So the next element I want to talk about is the HTML table. So the table is how we create charts or tables, like this one here on the MDN page for table. There's a table here. You can see we have a chart. There's another table here for colors. And then here's a few examples of the types of things that we're going to work on. So these are tables in HTML. They're pretty simple. Obviously, they're not the most beautiful things without styling, but they are very useful to display information in a tabular format. I'm going to go ahead and comment a lot of this file out. Remember, in Sublime, it's command/. And I'm going to put in a new table element. And inside of every table, and this is where it gets a little tricky because there's a few different ways of doing this. The first way I'm going to show you is we write a TR element, which stands for table row. And then inside of each table row, we put a TD element. So I'm going to just write this out just to show you something first, then we're going to come back and discuss it. So TD, and we're just going to put some random text here. So let's go back to colors, red and orange, and let's leave it at that. I refresh my page and I have a beautiful table. However, I don't have any border on this table, so it's hard to see what's happening. You would do this using CSS ordinarily. This is not a really great idea, the way that I did it here with the border attribute. This is sort of the old way of doing it. This is how you could do it back in HTML4, basically before things became more oriented around doing all your styling in your CSS. So you can still do it. I'm just going to do it here just to show you what's happening. So what I've done is made a table that is one row, and it has 2 elements, 2 TDs inside of a row. So I could make another row, and I'm going to make green and yellow. And take a moment to just think about what this should look like. When I refresh, we'll have 2 rows now, red and orange, and yellow and green. So again, we've got table, we've got TR for each row, and then a TD for each cell. So that's great. The next thing though that I want to show is how we could create a heading on the table. So let's change our data a bit, and let's make this table about people. So we'll have something like name and age, and then below that we'll have, name is, maybe this is dogs. How about that? Rusty, my dog who's 2, Wyatt, my other dog who is 13, and so on. So to do this, we want name and age to be part of the table. It's kind of the bolded heading of the table. And so there's another element. We'll make another row, and rather than TDs, we're going to use a tag called TH. So TH is for table head or table header, and we're going to have name and age. And then our first row, we'll go ahead and fill out Rusty, and his age is 2. And then our next row will be Wyatt, and his age is 13. It's getting old for a dog. So I refresh the page. Oh, well, you can see my beautiful diagram. Let's comment that out. And now here's my table. So I've got my THs in one row, and then I've got another row with 2 elements, and then another row with 2 elements. So one other thing we can discuss here. There is a slightly more complicated way to make the exact same table. And it's not really more complicated, it's just another tag or two that gives our table more meaning. So right now, our heading information, these 2 headers, are just part of a regular TR. So there's no distinction between this TR and this TR. They're both just table rows. Well, in HTML5, again, the emphasis is on making HTML, on having markup that is somewhat meaningful, so that if some other code is looking at this site, someone who is using a screen reader code can see my HTML and read it, and it will know the heading, and it will know what's the body of the table. That might behave slightly differently than if it just reads all of the rows out loud. So what we do, there are 2 elements that we can add, and there's a T head and a T body. And these will not make a difference at all in the appearance. But what I can do is just move the heading stuff, everything that corresponds to this top part, into a T head. And then what I'll do is move the actual body of the table, all the content, into T body. So it looks identical, nothing should change. And let's just do one other quick change here. So let's add another column. So this will be name, age, and breed. So Rusty is a mutt, and Wyatt is a golden. There we go. So that's the basics of tables. Again, they're not usually that ugly. We usually use CSS. And so this is just a normal table without any styling. And then we'll go into CSS and change the fonts and add a border and background colors and all of that. Okay, great. Okay, so it's time for another exercise here. This time we're doing something slightly different. I'm going to give you a bunch of data for Pokemon. Actually, the 3 starting Pokemon for the original Pokemon games. Does not matter if you have no idea what I'm talking about. If you absolutely hate Pokemon, doesn't matter. I'm giving you the data. Basically, you're going to take this data and you're going to turn it into a table like this. So this table is a chart. It has an image for each Pokemon, a name, a type, and what each Pokemon evolves into. So for instance, Bulbasaur looks like this. He/she is a grass/poison Pokemon, and Bulbasaur evolves into Ivysaur. And this is a link to the Ivysaur Pokedex or Pokemon Wiki website. So again, if you have no idea what those words mean at all, that's fine because you have all the data. So this is more about taking the data that I'm giving you and translating it into a table. So again, the data, we have a name, we've got an image, URL, we've got type, and then evolves to is both a name and a URL. Because remember, to make a link, you need some text to show up, but you also need the URL that you're linking to. All right, so go ahead, give this a shot. Okay, so let's go over a solution to this exercise. As always, you can take a look at the code right away. If you want to follow along, start from scratch with me, feel free to do so. So the very first thing we have to do is make a new file. I'll call it pokemon.html. Create our boilerplate, and let's fill in the title to match, which should be Pokemon chart. So we know this is going to have an H1 up top, and that H1 is just first gen Pokemon chart. And we know there's going to be a table, and that table is going to have a T head and a T body, which, just to refresh your memory, does not impact anything about how the table looks or behaves. It's purely about making our markup as semantic as possible, making it so that a search engine or a web crawler knows that this is the header right up here, and this is the body. So just a good idea, best practice. So next, we're going to add in our very top, the 4 headings. So 4 THs, we have image, name, type and evolves into. So let's go ahead and just check how this looks. All right, there's our table so far. The first thing we'll probably want to do is just to make it match what we had, we'll give it a border. Remember though, that we don't really want to be doing this later on in the class. So once we talk about CSS, we'll do all of the styling through CSS. This is just purely to make things visual for now. It's not a bad idea to know about it, but it is a bad idea really to do this professionally. Okay, so let's go take some of this data. I'm going to copy it down just to the bottom here and comment it all out. And then all I'm going to do is create my first row. So we'll start with Bulbasaur. So inside of tbody, we need a tr. Inside of that tr, we need 4 tds. The name is going to correspond to our second th, so I'm going to put it in the second td there. The image goes first. So I'm going to copy the image URL, and then I'm going to create an image tag and set the source equal to that URL inside of that td. If we wanted to, we might space it out a little bit like this. So we have, this doesn't impact anything. It's just purely aesthetic in our code so that we can see the relationships that this image is nested inside the TD. Then we've got name. Next, we have type, which is grass and poison. And then lastly, we have another more complex one where we have an A tag. Remember, it needs to look like this, A tag that says Ivysaur. So that A tag, let's copy the link that it needs to go to. And then let's copy the name for that content. And then I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. Oops, got rid of the comments. Well, get rid of that just so that we clean this up a bit. Let's refresh. And there's our first entry. Double check that it works. Click on Ivysaur. Great. Okay, so we're basically going to repeat the exact same process. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to copy this. So this whole row. And remember, you could do Control-C and paste it with Control-V or Command-C and Command-V. But also Sublime has this nice shortcut where you can select and hit Command-Shift-D. Command-Shift-D twice if we wanted to, and that will duplicate it twice. So now we've doubled that automatically, and we just need to go through and make some of the changes. So the first one, name is Charmander. The image URL. And we need Charmeleon. It's a fire type. And the URL here. Paste it in. Let's check on that. So we should have 2 Bulbasaurs because we copy and pasted. Charmeleon, the link is correct. Great. So now we just need to finish up with Squirtle. The image. Water. Let's go with the URL first of the link. Change the name. War Turtle. And strength is water. All right. Decent amount of copy and pasting there. There we go. Make sure it all works. Great. Okay, so that's all we needed to do. Let's make sure they match. Looks good. Great. One small change I might make while I'm here, just a good lesson on this. I'll add a comment here just to clarify for you guys. So this first one is Bulbasaur. Next, this is everything about Charmander. And lastly, this is everything that corresponds to Squirtle. One change though, as I mentioned, is these images are kind of massive. We could definitely shrink them down, and that would shrink the size of our table down. And this is something you would do with CSS. It is style information. So ideally we do it with CSS away from our HTML. We want to keep them separate. HTML is structure, CSS is style. But for this exercise, what we can do is add a width attribute to an image, give it a number like 50, and you'll see that as I refresh, this changes to 50 pixels, much smaller. We could change it to 500 and get a gigantic image. We'll keep it at 50. And another reason I want to show you this is rather than copying and pasting this 3 times, which works just fine, a better way of doing that in Sublime is to actually create 3 cursors. So I'll show you what I mean. We click, hold Command, click again, keep holding Command, and click again. And then we can start typing, and I have 3 cursors at once. Width equals 50. So this is pretty cool. It's a really useful one if you need to change multiple things at once. In the exact same way, you just Command click all over the place, and it spawns a bunch of cursors. And as you can see, we have a nice, more readable and sensibly sized table. All right, so in the next few videos, we're going to focus on HTML forms. So forms are how we get input from a user, whether it's to sign up for a page, to comment on a photo, to upload a photo, to pick a color, to pick a date. There's so many different things we do with forms. And it's actually relatively simple in HTML. There's just 2 important elements that we're going to learn about here. So we're going to focus on the form tag, the input tag, the label tag, and then we're also going to finish up by learning about validations for our data. How do we make sure someone fills in part of our form, someone cannot leave our password blank or email blank or something like that. So to start, let's just take a quick survey of some of the forms we encounter in day-to-day life. So I have some images here from sites like Twitter, Facebook, Google. Let's take a look and break some of these down. So here's the login form for Facebook. We have a place where we can type some text in, a text input, another input where we type passwords in. Most likely when you type your password there, it's dotted out, so you don't actually see the password. And then a checkbox. And when we click this button, it submits this entire thing. So it groups these together. We don't have one button for email, one button for password, one button for the checkbox. It all goes at once. Same thing here when we sign up. We've got more inputs, 5 different text inputs, 3 different drop-down menus. These are called select tags. And then 2 things called radio buttons. And then finally a sign up button that is going to take all of this and send it somewhere for Facebook to use. So what we're going to learn today is the form tag. And these forms are going to be a little bit dumb. They're not going to actually do anything. We need to actually have a backend set up. We need a database, we need some logic and some backend code to do anything with the forms. So for now, they're just going to look like this. We'll be able to recreate this. But when you click sign up or you click login or you search on Google, our forms aren't actually going to do any of that logic. They're just going to be the front end, the user-facing part of things. So the first thing is the form tag. So the form tag is basically a shell or a container for all of these different types of inputs. So this is one form tag around all of this. This might be one form tag around all of these, and so on. Here's another form tag. By just making a form tag, you don't actually see anything on the page. We'll see that in just a second. Basically, it's just a container, and we put all of our different inputs in there. So checkboxes and buttons and drop-down menus and color pickers all go inside of a form tag. So there are 2 important attributes. We'll be spending some more time with this when we get to backend. So try not to get hung up on exactly how this works. But a form is going to send a request somewhere. It sends data from the form to a server somewhere. So the first part, action, is going to specify where to send the data. Is it going to Google? Is it going to our sign up page? Is it going to our sign out? We're going to learn a lot more about how we actually do that on the back end section of this class. And then the second part is what type of HTTP request to send. So we could send a GET request or we could send a POST request. And again, this is another thing we're going to spend a lot more time on. But the simple generalized version, we make a GET request when we're doing something like searching, we're retrieving data, we're trying to get information. And we make a POST request when we're sending data that we want to be added to a database, posted to a server. So in these examples, this here, when you search on Google, you hit enter or you click on search, that's going to make a GET request. It's not actually adding anything to a database. It's not changing anything. It's purely just getting data back. Searching, it's getting data. It's a GET request. These here, though, to sign up for Facebook or sign up for Twitter, those are going to be post requests. When you type some data in and you click sign up, it takes your data and actually adds it to Twitter's database. So again, we're going to actually work on that quite a bit later in this class. So for now, just be familiar with action and method and the fact that they exist. So the input tag is what actually goes inside of our forms. It's what's going to create the different inputs that we see here: a text input, a password input, a radio button. It doesn't actually create a drop-down menu, so we'll talk about that in a later exercise, but it creates all sorts of different inputs for user input. So I have a few examples here. They're all exactly the same except for this type attribute. So if type equals text, we get a text box. Type equals date, we get this little date picker. Type equals color, we get a color picker. Type equals file, we get a file picker. Type equals checkbox, we get a checkbox. So I'm actually going to pull up MDN and search for input. And as I do that, you'll see as I scroll down to attributes, under type, there's a list of all the possible types that we can specify. And there's about 30 or 40 of them here. And to be honest, there's a lot on here that you probably will never need to use, but there are a few that you use all the time. And so we're going to really focus on those. Those are things like text, email, password, date, button, submit. Then some of the other ones like color, you may not use very often at all. I definitely wish we had more chances to do color pickers. It's my favorite of the inputs. But I want you to be aware that there's a lot of different choices here. So then to make a form, we just take a form tag and we fill it with some input tags. So here's a really simple example. We have two inputs, type equals text, type equals password, and it makes us this nice form here. And you can see as we fill out this first type equals text, it just looks like regular text. And as we fill out the type equals password, it gives us those dotted, the hidden password fields. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do here is actually get us building our own form. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Sublime. I have a new file, call it whatever you want. Mine is forms.html. I'm going to add my skeleton in there, the boilerplate, give it a nice title like form demo. And then I want to start, remember we have the form tag and then we have the input tag. We're going to start with the input. So let's play around with some input tags first. So let's just add a few here. We'll do text, we'll do color, which is my favorite. Let's try radio, and let's do password. And save that. Let's go ahead and open it up in Chrome. And you can see we have 4 different inputs. So this is text, this is color, this is a radio button, and this is password. So again, you can always go to MDN to see all the possible options for inputs. There's quite a few, but what we're going to go ahead and do is build the simple login form that we've seen. So all that we really need there are these 2 inputs, text and password. And then we're also going to want a button, and we have a few choices for buttons. We can do this, create a button tag, and click, let's say, submit here. But what we can also do is make another input with type equals submit. And you'll see, we refresh, they look identical. And they're not going to do anything in this case. So we have username, which is what will go here. And then we have our password. But that's not really clear to a user, just someone who's encountering this form for the first time. So there's a nice attribute called placeholder that we can add. And what placeholder will do, it takes some text. So I'm going to go ahead and add placeholder equals username, placeholder equals password. And it's just going to be the text that is temporarily filling the input before the user alters it. So we end up with, have a small typo here, placeholder. There we go. We end up with username and password. So let's go back. I'm just going to add an H1 here. Just say login. Here's our form. Although technically it's not a form yet. It's not a form tag. It just looks like a form to us. It's 2 inputs. Let's go with input type equals submit, just so that we can really hammer home this point that the type attribute can drastically change what input does. So the next thing that we want to do here is introduce the form tag. Right now what we have is something we might call a form in English, but technically in HTML it's not considered a form. It is just 3 inputs that are not related. So remember, the point of the form, it's just a container where we put our inputs. So yes, they can exist individually outside of a form, and sometimes we will have that. But if this is one form, one packaged up thing that we want to submit together, then it makes sense for us to make a form tag. So I'm going to go ahead and put this data inside the form tag and save it. And remember, in a form, there are 2 attributes we discussed. There's action, which is where the form sends data to. And then there's also method, which is what HTTP method, get or post. And just as a refresher, that shortcut, Command/ to get the comment. Okay, so if we refresh the page, nothing will change, or it will appear like nothing changes. There is one really small aesthetic change. So if I add some text down here, and I don't have the form tag, I refresh the page, you'll see that everything is in line. As soon as I add the form tag, however, the form pushes, it's a block level element, it pushes down that text to the new line. So a very minor thing, but other than that, it looks identical. There is functionally a change though. My form now, if I refresh the page, it actually does something. It's not very impressive, but if I fill out my username and some password and I hit submit, pay attention right here, and you'll see my page actually refreshes. My data disappears. This button to refresh the page is engaged briefly, as you can see. So my form is being sent. The thing is, it's just being sent to the same place where I currently am. So by default, if I don't specify an action, it's going to go to the exact same place where I am, just refresh the page. And if I don't specify a method, it's going to be a GET request. So we could go in and change that. We could say action and method equal, and let's change them to something else. Let's do action equals http://wikipedia.com. Method will be a GET request. Refresh the page. Let's fill out some data in here. Fill out my form. Click submit. This time, it's not going to send a request to the same page I am on. It's going to send a request to Wikipedia. And technically, this should be wikipedia.org, but they're smart enough that they realize people try and go to .com all the time, and it just redirects to .org. Okay, so that's the point of action. It's where we send data to. Of course, we're not really going to send data to Wikipedia or Google or Facebook from a form. We're going to send it to our own server, our own backend that we create. But we don't have that yet. So for now, we're just demonstrating that we can alter where the data goes by altering the action. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of both of these and just keep it as form, where action is going to refresh the same page that we're on, and method is going to be get. And if you're feeling at all confused about that, we will spend a lot of time talking about HTTP requests and methods and actions, so we will get there. For now, this is purely about the front end of making the form. So there's one other thing I want to talk about here is that when we actually submit this form, the data is sent along with this request. And there's a way for us to see that. So if we give a name to each piece of data that we want to be sent. So it's a name attribute. I'm going to call it username on the username input, and then I'm going to say name equals password on the password input. And I save this. I type in a username, Rusty, password will be test123. Pay attention up here as I submit this. And you'll see I get my data added in this new format that we haven't seen. It's called a query string. Another one of those topics we'll be devoting a lot more time to when we get to Express. Basically, it's a question mark followed by key value pairs separated by ampersands. So I have username, which is the name that I set, equals Rusty, which is the value from that input. Password is the name I set, equals test123. So the whole point of this is that we can give names to our data, to our pieces of data, so that we can then retrieve them later. So of course, we wouldn't actually send a password through the URL. We don't actually let a user or any user see the password. And that's because we use a post request usually, rather than a get request. There are ways of getting around this. So again, this is all for later in the class. But what's important is that this isn't something I'm showing to you because you'll do it all the time. I'm showing it to you because it illustrates the fact that when we type something into a form, and I give it some data, and I click submit, the data is taken out of that form and a request is sent somewhere. And in this case, it's sent to the exact same place where we already are. But if we change this to be action and go back to Wikipedia, wikipedia.org, username Rusty, password test123, you'll see it takes me to wikipedia.org and it adds my data here. So we've successfully sent a request using that form, and in that request, the data was extracted from the username and password fields and then sent along with the request. So that's the foundation of all the types of forms that we're going to do. It's not always a GET request, but our forms later on are going to extract data out, send it somewhere, and then we'll process the data and receive it on the back end. Okay, so next up, we're going to focus on labels in HTML forms. So labels are exactly what they sound like. They let us add captions to individual elements in our form. And the reason that we use them rather than just a paragraph or some plain text is that labels are really important for making our site accessible. So if someone is visually impaired or blind and they're accessing our form, they're trying to sign up, their screen reading software that they're using is going to look for label tags. And it's going to use those labels to know what each part of the form corresponds to. So it's really important. It's also a nice way just to add a little caption, as you can see here, explaining what each part of the form is used for. So there's two syntaxes we're going to cover. The very first one looks like this. Create a label tag. And then we actually put the input inside that label tag. So we might say something like username, and then we're just going to take this username input and put it inside. And rather than do this, it's a little bit better, make things spaced out a little bit so that we see the true relationship between things. So we'll put password, colon, and then the password input. And there we go. That's all we should need to do. Refresh the page. We now have two labels that correspond to our two inputs. So there is an alternate syntax. Rather than having our inputs nested inside of a label, we actually can do them completely separate, and we connect them in a slightly different way. You can see here we have a label, and it has a for attribute set equal to username, and then we have an input with an ID equal to username. So as long as these two match, screen readers and other accessibility software will know that this label that is for username is corresponding to this input with ID username. So just to show you that, I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate this, comment it out, just so we have it. And then what I'm going to do is move the input tags so that they're separate from the labels. They're no longer contained inside of that label tag. So they're no longer nested inside of one another. Okay. And the next thing is connecting them, because right now, although it will look the exact same, for software, for people who are visually impaired, these are not the exact same because they're not actually connected. There is no line connecting this label to this input. So in order to do that, we use the for attribute. Let's say for username. And then over here, we need to say ID is username. And we'll do the same thing, label for password. And just to be clear, the name does not matter. We do want to make sure that it's nice and meaningful. It's not just gibberish, but it does not matter as long as it matches the ID. And refresh. It looks exactly the same, but you can just trust our data is now connected. We have a label for every input. So in this video, we're going to focus on HTML5 form validations. So validations refer to the ability to enforce rules and structure on different parts of a form. So we can say that you cannot leave your email blank, or your password must be greater than 10 characters, or your email must follow a valid email syntax. So these validations are something that we're going to keep learning a lot about. We will do validations with JavaScript. We'll do validations on the back end. Today, we're just going to learn about the simple validations we can do with just plain HTML. So these are not going to be insanely complicated. We can't do anything really custom. So we might want down the line to do a custom validation to make sure that somebody's phone number follows the exact correct format, where we have an area code dash 3 numbers dash 4 numbers. We can't really do that with just HTML. But what we can do is two different things. We can check to make sure that something is not empty, it's required. So I'll show you how to do that to start. I'm going to go back to our form that we left off with. And let's just make sure that username is not empty. So all we have to do is go to input and add the required attribute. And this is a slightly different attribute. We don't have to say required equals true or anything. You can do that. All we do is say required. And just by adding it there, it's called a Boolean attribute. The fact that it's even present means that it's true. It is required. So this makes a pretty immediate impact. If I try and submit this form right now, Chrome is actually going to tell me, please fill out this field. One side note, this actually won't work in every single browser. It's actually up to the browser right now to implement this. But in Chrome, this will work. So it prevents the form from submitting. The page does not refresh. But if I do fill this in, the page now refreshes. It takes me to Wikipedia. Likewise, we can add required to our password field. It works the exact same way. If I leave them both blank, first it's going to yell at me for username. Then it will yell at me for password. Then it will submit the form. So that's one type of validation, which is what we would call a presence validation. It makes sure that something is there, it's required. The other type of validation that we can do is based around data type, or the format of data. So the simplest one is to make sure that an email actually looks like an email, that it actually has the correct format, where we have something at something.com or .some domain. So to do that, it's actually really simple. All that we need to do, so let's change this to be an email rather than username. Type equals email. And just by changing type to be email, and I'll change my placeholder just so it's clear what's happening. I refresh this. First thing that's going to happen when I submit, it's going to tell me, please fill it out. So then let's fill it out. Hello. Now it's going to tell me, please include an @ sign in the email address. Hello is missing an @ sign. So I can add my @ sign. Then it's still going to tell me, please enter a part following that. And let's just do gmail.com. Okay, so now that one passes. Then we still need our password. Now I click submit, and then it finally submits. So in this video, we're going to talk about 3 additional ways of getting user input. The first one, the radio button, is actually just another type of input tag that we've seen. It's similar to a checkbox. The next one, the select tag, is how we get drop-down menus. And finally, we're going to talk about the text area, which is how we can create text inputs that are multiple lines long. So I'm going to start, of course, with our standard HTML boilerplate. Go ahead and add in title, save that, and let's go ahead and add a radio button. So it's just input, type equals radio. And I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to give the other one type equals checkbox, just so you can see them side by side. So this is a radio button right here. I cannot turn it off once I've selected it. This is a checkbox, which I can toggle on and off. So the difference really is that a checkbox allows a user to select it or unselect it, to have, let's say there's 5 different choices of things that a user can check. Let's say we're asking users to select their, this is a job site, and we want them to select their skills. We want them to be able to say JavaScript and CSS and HTML, or maybe only JavaScript, and they're just a bunch of checkboxes that they check on and off. A radio button, however, is used usually when a user has one choice. So an example typically on websites would be something like gender, where it asks you to check male or female or other, and you only have one choice. You cannot, not select. You have to pick one of the elements. So to do that, let's say for our example, we're going to have a form where users pick if they prefer cats or dogs. And there's no option to pick both. Unfortunately, in this world, it is black or white. You either prefer cats or you prefer dogs. So to do that, we're going to have 2 radio buttons. And if that's all we do to start, I can pick one and I can also pick the other. Not quite what we want. I want to only be able to pick one. So the first thing I want to do is get a form going, and I'm going to move my inputs into that form. And for now, we're just going to leave it so that it's just a GET request, and it's just the default action, which is just to refresh the page. The next thing that we're going to do is add a few labels. So I'm going to go ahead and use the for syntax. So this will be for dogs. And then we have to give our input an ID, dogs. Remember, those have to match. Then same thing here. Another label tag for cats. And then ID cats. So if we refresh, now we have our 2 choices, but I can still pick both. So what we need to do is tell HTML these 2 radio buttons are for the same choice. So you can pick one or the other, but they are one decision. So to do that, we need to use the name attribute, which, remember, the name is giving an individual input a name that HTML can refer to it by, and it's also the way that it is stored or sent in the HTTP request. That name is important. So let's give it a name here. The first one, name will be, let's just call it pet choice. And then on input here, we're also going to give it the exact same name. And the reason we do that, you'll see in just a second, is that by giving them the same name, it then connects them so that we now can only pick one. So if we refresh, I can click dogs or cats, but not both. And one more thing I'll show you. Let's add a button to the end of the form. And what we've seen so far is actually input type equals submit at the bottom of a form, but I'm showing you a button just to show to you that if the button is the last thing in a form, it will actually submit the form. So there's a few options of inputs to actually submit the form at the end, a button at the end, or input type equals submit. So now let's pick dogs, of course, the only natural choice there. Remember, the name is pet choice. So we should see something up here in the query string, just like with any other inputs. When I click go, we see pet choice is equal to, and then on or on, which is not really what we expected. So we're missing one thing, which is we need to also say what the value of this decision is. So I'm going to go ahead and add the value tag, that value attribute, and let's just say this value will just be dog, and this one will be cats. And let's make it all caps just so that you can see what's coming from where. Okay, so what this says, if the user clicks on dogs, under the name pet choice, store the value dogs in all caps. If the user submits and clicks cats, under the value or the name pet choice, store the value cats in all caps. So just to show that to you, let's click on dogs, go, and we get pet choice equals dogs. If we do cats, we get pet choice equals cats. So the next element we're going to talk about is the select tag. And what the select tag lets us do is create nice drop-down menus. So the tag name is it's just select. It's an opening and closing tag. And if I just do that, and that's it, just select, and I refresh my page, I actually already get a drop-down menu. It's just totally empty. So along with the select tag, we use the option tag. So inside of there, for every possible option that we want a user to pick, we add an option tag. So let's do a drop-down that lets a user pick their favorite color. And let's do a few options here. Red, orange, and yellow. So as you can see, we already get a nice drop down here with our choices. And if I hit go, let's select orange, and I hit go, you'll see we don't actually get anything up here in the URL like we do if we select dogs. Let's do yellow this time. And I hit go, I still only get pet choice. And that's because we do not have a name that we've provided. So on our select, we need to give it a name. And let's just call it fave, or let's just go with color and leave it at that. And I refresh my page. Let's click cats. Let's click on yellow. And watch up here as I hit go. I now get pet choice is cats and color is yellow. So what you'll see is that depending on the option that I have selected, in this case yellow, the browser takes whatever the text is inside of that option, and it just sends that as the value under the name color. So we don't always want the value that is sent along in the request to be identical to whatever is displayed to the user in the dropdown. So an example of that might be something like if we wanted a user to pick a mood. So let's say, what's your current mood? And we want to have a happy face here, a emotionless face, I guess, and a sad face. And we end up with this nice drop down here with our emoticons. But let's say that when a user selects happy, we don't want all of this to be sent. Instead, we want the word happy to be sent, or the word sad to be sent. To do that, we use the value tag, the value attribute. So we'll say value equals, and let's just say happy, value equals neutral, and value equals sad. Now if I refresh, I click dogs, let's go with sad, and I click go, you can see I get pet choice is dogs and color is equal to sad. And of course that's because we kept the name as color. We would want to change that to be mood just so that our markup is meaningful and actually makes sense. So cats, let's do happy, I get mood is equal to happy. Okay, so that's all we need to cover with selects. One other thing is the text area tag. And text area, I'll pull it up on NDN, is a nice way to create inputs that are more than one line. So we've seen text inputs like this. Input type equals text. And they are single lines. But what if we wanted to ask a user for a bio or to copy and paste a resume or something? That is not going to work very well in this really slim short input. So text area, it's actually another tag just like select. So it's not an input, with a type. It's actually a separate type of form control. And the way that it works, there's two important parts. The first is we create a text area tag, and that on its own is going to give us this text area. But what we can also do is specify exactly how big that text area is using these two attributes, rows and columns. So I'll show you that here. Let's start with 10 rows and 50 columns. And you can see that my text area expanded in both directions, but it definitely got wider. So let's say I now want 100 rows. You can see it gets a lot longer. So basically we can specify how many rows and how many columns to change the dimensions of our text area. One other thing about it is, just like with these other elements, let's go back to a smaller one. Let's do 10 by 10. Just like with these other elements, if I wanted to send this data in the request, let's get rid of this input, I would need to give it a name. Name is equal to, and let's just say paragraph. Fill out this paragraph with some text. I click go, and you can see if I expand this, I get paragraph equals whatever text I have in here. There we go. So it's time again for another exercise. So this project here is going to cover everything that we talked about in the last few videos. So that includes things like the form tag, different types of inputs, including drop-down menus, radio buttons. It also includes validations and labels. So pretty much everything we've talked about. And what you're going to do is combine them to make a registration form for some fake website. So it's going to look like this. A form where a user can go sign up with a name, first name, last name, pick gender, pick an email, password, a birthday with 3 drop-down menus, and a checkbox to agree to the terms and conditions. So again, a few hints here. These should be text inputs. This should be a password input. This should be an email input. These are radio buttons. These are 3 select tags. This is a checkbox input, and this is a submit input. So there are validations that are required. So first name, last name, and email cannot be blank. They are required. Email must be a valid email address. So that has to follow the correct email format. And there is a bonus here. And this is one that I encourage everyone to try and find. So the point of this, this is one of our first instances of me asking you to do something that I haven't directly shown you how to do. And as I've said before, this is really what it's like to be a developer. You're tasked with something, you have some idea you want to try, and you have no idea how to do it. So you go online and you do some researching. So the exercise here is to add another validation, a new type that we haven't talked about yet, which is to validate the length of something. And the way it should work, the password that the user types in must be between 5 and 10 characters. Otherwise, we get this error here. So it's another one of these validations. It's just one that we haven't seen yet. So I recommend just pulling up Google and searching away. One quick note, this needs to be in HTML. So if you know JavaScript, no JavaScript allowed. That's considered cheating for this exercise. And then one last thing, the 3 drop-down menus, those need to be select tags. One note though, you do not need to have all the years, all the months, all the days in a month. That's just busy work. I would just get 2 or 3 items in there just so you can see, have the 3 select the select drop-down menus there. You don't need to worry about filling them though. Okay, so go ahead and get started. If you want to stick around for another moment, I'm just going to give a demo of the actual site now. So again, if I leave everything blank, I need to fill this out. I need to fill in last name, radio button here, email. If I leave it blank, it tells me I need to fill it in. If I don't put a proper email, it gets mad at me. And then password has to be filled out. 1 character is not enough. 4 characters not enough. Now if I go to 5 or 6 or whatever this is, I now have enough characters. I have my drop-down menu, pick a birthday, I can agree or not agree, And now the form will submit. Okay, so that's it there. Go ahead and attempt this on your own. And then as always, I'll break it down step by step in the next video. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and create the solution for this registration form. So I have a new file. I'm going to save it. I'm just going to call this registration form.html. Use my nice Sublime shortcut and get our boilerplate going. So when we're faced with a project like this, there's quite a few places that we could start. And the first thing that I'm going to do is add the form tag in. And then I'm also going to add this H1 just up top here. And we'll just put register. So let's go ahead and open our registration form here. I'm going to move it over. Okay, not quite there yet, but at least our H1 is looking good. So let's go back to Sublime, and let's start with the simplest thing, which would be this top level of inputs, the first name and last name. So we'll start with input, and those are type equals text. Oops. And let's give it a placeholder, which looks like it should be John. Let's do another one. Placeholder is Smith. And then we need to give 2 labels. So we could use either syntax for labels. I'm going to use the for, and so we'll call this first, and then we'll make sure we give an ID equal to first. And then this label will say first name colon, which will give us that. And then we need to do the exact same thing. Another label for last. This one will say last name colon. And then we need to give this ID equals last. So let's check in, see what we have. So far, so good. There's one small thing that we're missing, which is we haven't given these inputs a name. So I'll just give it the name first and name last. Great. So let's move on to the next chunk here. Oh, we're actually missing one thing, which is the validations. So while we're here, remember that first name and last name are not supposed to be blank. So in order to do that, it's very simple. We just add the required attribute on the inputs, required, and set that to be true. So I'm going to go ahead and expand this just so that we can see a little bit clearer what we're working on. So the next thing, if we consult the form here, is the gender radio button. So we need to have 3 radio buttons. So those are input, type equals radio, 3 of them. And if we take a look at what that gives us, first thing you'll see is that they are in line with the other elements, which is not actually what the form that I gave you is supposed to look like. So we have a few options to get things to behave. We can throw them in a paragraph, like this, just to add some spacing. And now we get them on a separate line. I'm just going to use a div here. There you go. You can see a div doesn't quite have the same spacing that a paragraph has. In the CSS video, we'll actually talk about what that spacing is. So now we need to go ahead and add our labels. And before we do that, let's actually give them the same name. So name will be gender here. Just go ahead and I should have used my shortcut here, which is to command click multiple cursors. So we give them name equals gender, and then let's give them each a value. So the first one, the value will be male. Second one will be female. The last one is other. And we refresh. We don't see any of that, of course, because that's just behind the scenes. So what we need to do is add in our labels. So we're going to want 3 labels. first one, we're going to say label for, and we'll just call this male. Let's see, did we have colons here? No colons, so just male, and then ID equals male. Same thing, another label here. This one will be female, and then we're going to want to say ID, for equals female, and then we want to say ID equals female. So as you can see, building these forms, it gets a little tedious sometimes when you have a bunch of labels and a lot of nested things. You just have to be extra careful that you have everything corresponding correctly. So we want for other, and then we want to do ID equals other. So let's just check in on this, see what we have. All right, that looks great. We can only select one, which is what we want. Next thing we can move on to, let's go ahead and add the submit button at the end, just while we're here. So that's going to be input type equals submit. And let's just make sure validation works. Yes, it does. Great, in good shape. So next up, we have an email and a password field, and those are on new line as well. So let's go ahead and add another div, and we're going to do an input. And this time it's type equals email. It's not just text. And the placeholder here was your email, which is admittedly not the best placeholder text, but we're going to stick to the image, make sure we follow the assignment. So input, type is email, placeholder is your email, and then we have another one for password. And that gives us the two inputs. Next up, we can either go with name, so we'll just say name is email here. And remember, in case you're confused, that name is purely used behind the scenes to figure out how to send the data. What should we send the data in the request under? What's the name of it? So in this case, whatever we type in this field is going to be called email. So we won't see an impact. Just in case, I do think this is one of the more confusing parts because it's not very visual. So this one, we'll say name is password. And then let's go ahead and add our labels. So just to mix it up here, I will use the other type of label, which is where we nest the data inside the label itself. So we'll say email colon, rather than the for and ID syntax, they work the same way. Let's do email and password. Let's be very precise. There are colons on both of them. Great. Let's save that. And there is one other thing that we should take a look at. Let's see, our validations are in place. Let's fill this in. No. So one thing that we're missing is we need to require the email. So we need to go to our email and add required. Now we refresh, fill these out, we leave email blank. If we type in a non-valid email, we get this error. Great. So far, everything looks good. We're going to come back to the bonus password validation at the end. Before we get there, let's move on to the birthday select. So 3 drop-down menus. So again, I'm going to add another div. And this time in this div, we're going to add 3 different selects. So 1, 2, 3. Let's start with this first one, which is for month. And let's go ahead and start with the label. There's only one label here for everything. So I'm going to do it like this. Label, and put all 3 selects inside. And this label is going to say birthday. And it's going to look like that. So if we see what we get, we have our 3 inputs, our 3 labels. And all that we need to do is add in the correct data inside. So that's a bunch of options. So the first one, let's go ahead and add, I'm just going to do 2 or 3 here. So this will be for months. So we'll do Jan, Feb, and March. The next one, we'll do the same thing, just a few options. And this will be for day. So we'll start, let's do double digits. So 10, 11, and 12. And the last one will be the year. Let's just do 3 again. And let's do 1999, 2000, 2001. Great. And you can see we get our drop down here. There is one small difference though, which is that ours start right away with January and numbers and the year. But the one that I gave you starts off with month, day, and year. So there's a few ways of doing that. The simplest one is just to make the very first option say month, day, and year. And by doing that, HTML, the form just picks the very first option and it decides that's the initial value. So that's the most common way of doing that. So now our form looks pretty good. We just need our final I agree to terms and conditions checkbox. So we can add yet another div here. And let's indent this properly. Our final div inside of this one, we're going to, let's start with a label. This time, let's do for, and this one, let's call it agreed. I agree to the terms and conditions. And then the next thing that we need is our input type equals checkbox. Let's give it ID equals agreed. And to name, we'll also go with agreed. And let's see what we get. Looks good to me. So one thing that we also need to add to our select tags is a name. So let's just call this month. And this one will be day, and this one will be year. And remember that if we didn't want January and Feb and Mar to be what was actually sent through, if we wanted it to be something different, like a number corresponding, we would put a value here. So for Jan, we might put value 1. In this case, I'm fine with just having Jan there. I didn't specify how it needs to behave. So we come back here. It looks pretty good. Everything looks the same. The last thing we really have to discuss is the actual password validation. So I want to just show you how you could go about finding that. So I'm just going to open up HTML length validation. And let's try that. As you can see, I've actually already been here. This is something I had to look up recently. And it looks like, so this is Stack Overflow, by the way, if you haven't seen this before. This allows someone to pose a question. Is there any other attribute in HTML with the help of which I can set minimal length of value for fields? And then people provide answers, and the highest voted answers appear first. So this answer says, you can use the pattern attribute. The required attribute is also needed, otherwise an input field with an empty value will be excluded from the constraint validation. Okay? So it looks like this is all we need. So this is an input, and we give it pattern equals, and this weird looking thing, and then required, and then this title. So before we even ask about what this even does and what this 5,10 does, let's just see. So let's go ahead, find our password, and this is a lot of what being a developer is. It's a lot of copying and pasting some things or finding some code and tweaking it. So we need to make this fit what we have, which is an input name is password, type equals password. So I'm just going to copy these 3 attributes. So now we have type is password, pattern is 5,10, required, and title equals 5 to 10 characters. So let's see what that does. Refresh this. Make sure we have everything else filled out. I click submit, and it tells me, please fill out this field, 5 to 10 characters. I type 2 in, type 3 in, type more than 10, it doesn't work. But if I type 5 or 6, it does work. So let's explore a little bit more. Let's start with this one here. Let's change this to be password must be between 5 and 10 characters. And refresh. Make sure we fill out everything else so we can get this error. And I click submit, and you can see I get that message that we set. Password must be between 5 and 10 characters. So that's what this title is doing. It's basically the error message that is being displayed. So then the other new part is this pattern. And this is admittedly a little weird, but using this syntax, we're just defining the length, a range of the length that is acceptable for this input. So if we change this to be 2 to 3, I submit, still not acceptable. 1 is not acceptable, but 2 is acceptable. So this is just defining a range or a pattern that we need to follow. So there is definitely more to this. You can do other things besides a minimum length or a range of lengths, but that's all I needed you to find here. If you weren't unable to find that, don't panic. It's still very early on, but there are going to be more opportunities for you to attempt things like that. So I do have a full solution that I wrote up, which is complete in that it has the full day and year and month inputs. And you can see it's kind of a mess. I did not write this by hand, and I did not expect you to write this by hand either. So we'll see how to actually generate this later on in the class. You could use JavaScript to do it for you, so you don't actually have to write this all. So take a look at the solution if you have any questions.